Hi, I'm Brie Schmidt Zdravkovic. I'm the managing broker of Second City Real Estate, and I'm here today talking about the Northwest Preservation Ordinance with Bob Floss.
How are you?
Good, how are you?
Good.
Bob, I wanted Bob here today. So he was the one who spearheaded the education for the Chicago Bar Association on this ordinance and has done a ton of research on the ordinances not only in the Chicago market as well as other markets that have similar ordinances and wanted to talk with him today about how this is really going to impact investors. So, Bob, what do you do?
What do I do? I'm the owner of Floss Law, so I'm a real estate attorney, which means primarily I do real estate closings, but as we always talk about, it encompasses a lot more than that. So it's a lot of the complications that go into doing a real estate closing. In addition to that, I do serve as the co-chair for the Chicago Bar Association Residential Real Estate Committee and also sit on the Illinois State Bar Association Residential Real Estate Committee. So it gives me a lot of opportunity to talk to other people in the business, and it gives me a lot of opportunity to stay up to date on changes like this, so that we're doing everything we can to help out our clients.
There's a few parts to this ordinance, so can you give us a short summary of what's happening?
There's really two main parts. So whenever we talk about this ordinance, you have to make sure we split it up into two main factions, and that's we're going to talk about a lot of the confusion with this ordinance as well as talking about the ordinance. The first part is the increase to building permits, which encompasses two main areas of the city, and then the right of first refusal, which encompasses only one part of the city. So the um, increase in the building permits is going to be in Pilsen and what we refer to as the 606 neighborhood. The right of first refusal is only in that 606 neighborhood. So Pilsen, they're only worried about the increase in the building permits, not on the right of first refusal.
The demolition fee is not new to these areas. It's been in Pilsen since 2021
Mm-hmm.
at a much lower amount, and it's
Much
been in
better.
the 606 area, but now that's been expanded.
Correct. Yeah. So
The
it's
boundaries have been expanded.
well, it's increasing the fees obviously, so it's much more for generating revenue for the city and for affordable housing, but also expands on what the rules are as far as what you can do and cannot do. So the whole idea encompassing all of this is for preserving affordable housing. So the 606 neighborhood and Pilsen are areas of the city where they're seeing a lot of residential development. It's a bit of a boom. And what the intention here is to make sure that we could preserve affordable housing for the people who do live in those neighborhoods so they could stay there and it doesn't get improved to the point that the people in those neighborhoods get pushed out. So the idea here is preservation. When we look at the increase of the building permits, the idea there is to try to discourage removing viable, thriving two flats and three flats and putting ultra high luxury single family homes that we've seen in some other areas of the city. If it is a viable two flat, three flat, they want it to remain that if possible. Now, as we deal with a lot, sometimes those properties are not viable. Unfortunately, they've been ignored, abandoned for a really long period of time, and it becomes too expensive. You could still develop those properties and potentially turn them into single family. It's just going to cost more to do so. But the idea is to encourage developers to leave them in their current use instead of dezoning them and making them into just these high end multi-million dollar single family homes and pushing out renters.
Okay. So it doesn't matter if you tear it down and build a completely new construction or you leave the existing frame and then just demo the inside. If you're deconverting the number of units, you're then paying this fee.
Yeah.
So this fee used to be $15,000. Now the fee is $60,000 or $20,000 per unit that you demolish.
Correct. Yeah. So if you have a 5 or 6 unit, it's going to be $20,000 per unit, and also for a coach house. If you want to do a coach house, $20,000 for that coach house.
Let's go back a bit because this problem, this deconversion problem,
Mhm.
is not specific to these neighborhoods.
No, no.
This is a problem that we've had in the city for at least the last 13 years that I've been a Chicago landlord, which is we are taking 2 to 4 unit properties on every single block and every single part of the city and deconverting them into ultra luxury single family homes. One of the things I really like about this ordinance is that it preserves that, the rule now is that 50% of the housing on that street is limited to being single family houses. So there can't be 65 or 60 or 5, so 50% of that block is the maximum that can be single family houses. So that's one of the parts of the ordinance that I really like. So the whole intention of this ordinance, right, is to keep the Chicago housing stock similar to how it is now. The problem though is you've got areas like, look at Lincoln Park, North Center, Lincoln Square, Bucktown, Wicker Park, right, that have had all these deconversions and that are pushing people into new neighborhoods.
Correct.
My first property I bought in Albany Park in 2011, and I can tell you 13 years later, Albany Park is a much different neighborhood. It's because people are getting pushed out of the other neighborhoods and they're moving more north and west. So to me, this solution, right, is a Band-Aid, right? The house foundation is cracking, the house is sinking, right? And we are propping up one corner with bubble gum and popsicle sticks. It's not gonna fix this whole problem. The problem is citywide. So one of my concerns is this really falls onto the zoning, right? Decades ago, they redid the Chicago zoning map and made every single side street in Chicago RS3. So RS3 allows for single family houses or 2 flats. It does not allow for 3, 4, or 5+ units. And they just blanketed the city and said side street RS3. So as a landlord with a 3-unit property, you are in a non-conforming status. So if your property is destroyed by your hand, you must then bring it into conforming status, which is single family or 2 flat. If the property is destroyed, let's say a semi truck runs into your building, right? Or a tenant starts a fire, you could then rebuild in its non-conforming state, which would be a legal 3-unit. What if we redid the Chicago zoning map? What if all multi-unit properties were rezoned RT4, which allows for added density, right? And then that then stops developers from having the right, because that's really, this is land use rights.
Yes.
By right, they are just bringing these properties into conforming status by developing a single family house. If we change the zoning, they wouldn't be able to just do that on every single side street in the entire city of Chicago.
It's a big topic. We're going down zoning in Chicago. Brie and I, if you can't tell, talk about this quite a bit.
I don't think anyone in the entire city of Chicago has dealt with zoning more than Bob and I have. The issue is though how we are losing housing units. So I used to live in North Center. I lived in North Center from 2013 to 2017 on Claremont. When I moved into that neighborhood, it was maybe 20% single families, 80% houses. And when I moved out of that neighborhood, it was flipped. It was 20% small apartment buildings and 80% single families. And that was the trend. Everyone was buying 2 to 4 unit properties, deconverting them into large single family houses, and then selling them for $2 million. But that was their right with the land because it was zoned RS3. So they didn't have to go through any sort of zoning approval. They were able to just pull plans and permits, and then they were just bringing that house in a non-conforming status. If we did something to stop that ability, right, that would then completely change the landscape, right? Because I have a huge concern as well as the alderman who wrote this ordinance of preserving these small multifamily buildings.
We need them.
We absolutely need them. In a city this size, depending on the neighborhood, a lot of neighborhoods here used to be 50 to 70% 2 to 4 unit properties. And we're seeing that drop at a dramatic rate. So
it's already affected and the reason that they're fighting this so hard, it's happened to so many areas of the city already. Yeah. I mean, you look at Bucktown, Wicker Park, you look at any area where we saw a real estate boom, almost immediately it followed real estate developers tearing down all the multifamily, putting up single family homes.
So flippers, rehabbers, developers, right? It's a business model. We look at what we can get the property for, how much it costs to renovate, and what we can sell it for. Let's say we have a property we can sell for $1 million, and it's going to cost $500,000 to renovate, right? That flipper rehabber is looking at probably between $100,000 to $150,000 margin, which backtracks into we need to buy this property for $350,000. So now, if we have an additional cost of let's say $60,000 demolition fee, right? Is the developer, rehabber, flipper going to then reduce their margin? And the answer is no. The seller is going to have to reduce their purchase price. So what's going to happen by this, this increased demo fee is that it's literally wiping out decades of equity for these sellers. And as you and I know, a lot of these properties are not salvageable, right? A move-in ready, right? Let's just say you've got a 3-unit property that was updated in the 90s, right? Are you going to demolish that and then turn that into a single family? No, because you can't get it cheap enough, right? Someone is going to buy that and pay market rent, market rate.
100%.
They're going to do cosmetic updates and they're going to continue to keep it as a 3 flat. So a lot of these properties either cost more to renovate than they do to actually rebuild.
Yes.
And they've had deferred maintenance for years, if not decades.
Oh, I not exaggerating. I have sold multifamily. I'm trying to think, 2 flats, 3 flats, all across the board. Not exaggerating. Buildings that were abandoned for easily 30 to 40 years, which sounds crazy to say. There are properties all over the city of Chicago. They just sit completely abandoned in horrible condition, horrible disrepair. And it just boggles your mind to think, how could someone have just let this thing completely waste here? But it happens, and it happens with a lot of regularity. And with those properties, you have significant code violations, you have significant building code violations that have to be corrected. Um, it's not unusual to have maybe a $30,000 maybe unpaid water bill of the city of Chicago, years of unpaid taxes. So, you probably say, well, why don't people sell those properties? A lot of times they're either upside down or at break even, and they're just not interested in doing anything with the properties because they realize they have all these bills they have to pay on it. So their solution is just to leave it there. So there are way more than you think.
Oh, yeah. Not only
Deal
that.
with them almost every day.
Firehouses,
Yes.
insurance claims. I've seen so many houses that were completely covered in mold. Where, I've seen houses that I was, when I was pregnant and showing houses, I had to buy a special mask to go into to do my job because that's what I see day in and day out, right? I've
Yeah, you see
never
see a lot of biohazards when you're doing these properties. Yeah.
And those properties need to be demolished, likely, and fully renovated. And those fall under this ordinance. So the other part of this ordinance, which is the more challenging part, in my opinion, is the right of first refusal. So this applies only to the 606 area, not the Pilsen area.
Yeah.
Can you give us an explanation of what the right of first refusal is?
So the right of first refusal is a very lengthy process, which has been part of the heavy criticism with it. When someone else has a contract to buy a property, you can say, under the same terms that they said they're going to buy your property, I am going to buy the property. So it's a first right to say, based on the terms of the sale, I will give you the same purchase price, the same closing date, the same terms, but instead of this other third party person buying it, I'm going to buy the property. So the tenants or a tenant association, so the tenants can form a tenant association by voting on it. Basically, the tenants in the building can get together and decide they want to be an association, and that's 75% of the tenants in a 5 and up multifamily, and it's 50% of the tenants in a you know
400.
see, yeah, 4 and under. They're good ways in it. That decide to form an association. When you form that tenant association, that association is then trying to buy the property versus a single tenant could say, in a 2 flat, one of the tenants will say, I'm going to try to buy the property myself. So you're running into deciding if they're going to form the association or not, moving forward with that purchase. And then there's again a set time limit. When you're selling any rental property in the 606 neighborhood.
So a condo even that you have rented.
Any rental property, single family, 2 flat, up to multifamily, anything with a tenant in it. When you go to sell that property, first there's going to be a notice provision. So you had to provide notice to the tenants, and there's different lengths of time for that notice depending on how big the property is. You don't have to really generate any of these notices. All this is going to be provided by the Department of Housing. So all these forms are on the Department of Housing website for the city of Chicago. So you'll just be able to pull up the form, fill it out, So you make sure that you comply with the ordinance. So you don't have to create any of these documents. They're going to be provided for you, but you are going to have to send the notice to all the tenants. Now, the part that I was critical of, it's the notice provision is very similar to me, is worded very similar to when we're providing a notice to a tenant when we're doing an eviction. So we have to show that we either give personal service to the tenant, or we need to have certified mail with that signed green card, which is next to impossible to get. I never get the signed green card back, or some other form of delivery, which it means basically a special process server. So that puts the responsibility on the landlord, the property manager, to either get personal service on all the tenants that you gave them this notice, or you have to basically go hire the Cook County Sheriff or a special process server to go deliver all these notices to the tenant, because those notices have to stay on file for 3 years, and the Department of Housing can come in and audit that and make sure that you complied with all the steps of the Department of Housing. And they can go back, retroactively and audit your files and make sure you did everything the right way in case someone complains later, or if they find out you're a bad actor, you're not complying. So the first step is this very stringent notice provision. We have to make sure that we comply with that. Then you get to go ahead and accept your offer. Once you accept your offer, then you again have to deliver notice to the tenants that you've accepted an offer on the property, and now their right of first refusal has begun ticking.
So let's break this down, because there's residential assets, which is anything from condo, single families, 2 to 4 unit properties. And then there's commercial assets, which is everything above 5 units. So the process and restrictions are easier on the residential assets. So we've got shorter time frames versus the commercial, and it impacts two different kinds of people, really. My business is 90% 2 to 4 unit properties. So my business over the last, 10 plus years as an agent has been working with small mom and pop landlords, right? Who typically the profile is they own anywhere between 3 and 5 properties, and they're mom and pop self-funded. Versus a commercial asset is typically a corporation or a company, right? Or a pool of investors, a syndication, right? And that's a different structure and timeline, so it impacts our businesses differently.
So it's much quicker for a smaller property, obviously. So there's a big jump when you go up to the multifamily. Though, at the point that you give them that form, you have to give them pretty lengthy amount of information, part of that. So you have to actually give them.
Well, you're not required to. If they request it, you have to give it.
Well, no, there's certain things you have to give them.
Okay.
You have to give them the contract.
Yeah.
You have to give them a list of every unit in the building, the bedroom and the bath count, and you have to actually give them a list of what all the tenants in the property and how much rent that they're paying.
Okay.
So you have to actually give them a breakdown of the profit and loss for the building, unit by unit, so they're going to get to see what all the other tenants in the building are paying. So that could be a little awkward for depending on the property. You have to give them all that information. The tenant then you go into a due diligence period as you would with any purchase. And the ordinance does say if the tenant makes any reasonable request, you need to comply with it. So if they say, I want to see additional information, I want to see the water records, I want to see any building code violations on the property, I want to see anything, you have to give it to them. So the tenant, you have to treat the tenant as though they're a normal buyer. Anything they ask for, you need to provide it to them. So you're really negotiating directly with your tenant at that point. How is this going to evolve over time? One thing I learned about in DC is you get the third-party contract, you then schedule the inspection, and that third-party purchaser not only schedules the inspection to go through the units, but uses that time to look at the units to engage in a dialogue with the tenants. So the purchaser is engaging in a tenant dialogue to find out, number one, will they agree to waiving the right of first refusal, so that the buyer, at the same time of reviewing each unit, make sure everything looks good, is asking the tenant, will they waive their right of first refusal, or what happens a lot in DC, I found out, engaging in some form of negotiation for the waiver of the right of first refusal. So going to each tenant saying, well, look, if you sign this so I can move forward buying the building, we'll make sure you get that new refrigerator that you want. Or, the windows are drafty, we could probably replace those 2 windows. we just need you to sign this form. So it's much more of a give and take, where the third party buyer is really the one that's engaging with the tenants, because potentially they're going to be their new landlord, and sort of cutting a deal as far as what the tenant is willing to get in order to sign off on that form, in order for the process to move forward. It's an interesting situation.
So also wanted to mention, under this ordinance, the tenants have the right to essentially sell their contract. They have the right to exercise their right of first refusal, and then they have a right to then sell that contract to a third party. So that's actually what happened with my client that's doing the 1031.
Oh.
He spent 2 years finding land that he absolutely loved, found it, made them an offer. There was a right of first refusal on it. So the person then exercised their right of first refusal on the contract, and then sold it back to him for another $40,000.
Made a little, you can do that.
You can do that.
You can do that.
So that's an issue.
One critical part of this whole process is the right of first refusal never ends. It can keep renewing. And what do I mean by that? So the third party buyer puts his contract on the property, and let's say they decide, now that I got through the units, which happens a lot with investment properties, looks like you guys need a new boiler, the roof is busted, unless you guys want to give me a $30,000 credit, I'm not really interested in the property. The deal falls apart, they walk from the deal. So if that contract falls apart, and then you go get a new contract, everything starts all over again. So everything is tied to that buyer contract. So you get the buyer contract, you give the notice to the tenants, and they get their period of time. If that buyer contract falls, once you get a new contract in, all the timelines start all over again. You have to go through the entire process of notifying the tenants and giving them a right of first refusal all over again, because the right of first refusal isn't just tied to the property, it's tied to that specific contract.
So let's say you do see like there's an issue with the roof or a material defect, you renegotiate the contract price, you offer a credit. That then, if it's 10%, right?
So the proposed amendment to the ordinance is that if there's a 10% adjustment to the purchase price, as long as you stay within that 10%, you're okay. But if you go over 10%, then you then you have to start the right of first refusal process all over again.
Once you deliver that 30-day notice of intent, you cannot get rid of any tenants unless you have just cause.
Correct.
So
you have to honor the terms of the lease, but if the lease expires prior than 6 months, you have to at least give them 6 months. If you have a tenant that's been in the property for more than 3 years, you don't give them a 30-day notice. We have to give them a 120-day notice to vacate the property.
And then so it's 0 to 6 months is 30 days notice.
Yeah.
6 months to 3 years is 60 days notice, and then 3+ years is 120-day notice. That's the fair notice ordinance, which has been around for a few years.
It's been around. We've been dealing with it for a while, but anyone who's out of the neighborhood, that might sound crazy. We've just learned to deal with it. That occasionally we have to give 120-day notices to tenants.
But here's the challenge, and this is one of the parts of this ordinance that was not, no one consulted, right? Anyone that does real estate or lending, is that under the provisions of an owner-occupied loan, the owner must move into the property within 60 days. So if you are, I see this all the time, it drives me absolutely insane. It's like one of my million pet peeves I have in real estate.
We have many. But
we do have many.
We have many.
Is when a seller leases up all 4 units or all 3, 2, whatever units for the next year and then puts it on the market.
Yeah.
Right? What you're doing is exposing your property to 10% of the buyers. Because 90% of the buyers, in my opinion and in my experience, are owner-occupied. And so if you fully lease it up and allow us no ability to move in, right, you are then lowering essentially your sales price, because only an investor is going to buy that, and they're looking strictly at numbers. A homeowner, an owner-occupied, a house hacker, as we call them, right, will pay a premium to live in a unit they love or near something that they want, right? They will pay more. So pet peeve lesson of the day, do not lease up all of your units, right? I've now followed for the last few years with my properties, and I tell all my clients to do this too. After the first year, I default everyone month to month, right? It gives me flexibility, right? If I decide to sell, I'm not, putting myself in a hole, because I've had it happen twice in the last year where people have come to me and said, hey, we're going to sell the building. And then they're like, you know what, we're changing our mind.
Oh yeah,
So,
that happens all the time. Oh,
let's
yeah.
re-sign everyone's
absolutely.
leases.
Yes.
And then 6 months go by, they're like, we're selling the building. I'm like, no, you're not. You know, and both times we tried to sell it fully leased, and both times we had to pull it off the market, wait till
It's too
the
difficult.
leases. It's too difficult.
It's too difficult. There is this conception as though BlackRock's coming in and buying up all of the properties.
They're not.
They really, if they are, it's not in these neighborhoods, and they're not any deals that we're doing. And we do a fair amount of business, and we don't deal with. I've never, I think once or twice I've dealt with a BlackRock subsidiary on a sale, but it's almost exclusively mom and pop investors, meaning a young couple, someone who probably owns anywhere from 1 to 10 properties. So some people will kind of come up with a formula where they do this several times, where they do an FHA owner occupied, they live in a property for a year, then they refinance, then they move to the next one, and they do that for several years. And then eventually they reach a point where they go, okay, I think we're good, we'll stop now. But those are primarily the clients that we deal with, are just regular people that are buying these properties. There's not these huge corporations coming in and buying these properties. So when you're trying to prepare your property for market, and it sounds like you tell your clients the exact same thing I tell my clients, or our clients, you want to appeal to, particularly if you're like a 2-flat to 3-flat, your target buyer is owner-occupied FHA buyer. That
or low
is,
money down.
Or low money down. Or low money down, yeah. That's primarily your buyer pool, where you're going to get the best value for your money. And that requires having either a vacant unit or a unit that's about to vacate.
Yeah.
You have to have one of those. What do you do in a situation where the seller has a pending foreclosure? We have a sheriff's sale date. Sellers in seriously delinquent on a mortgage, and there's, maybe it's a hard money loan that there's 12% accruing interest every month, and now you have to tell the seller, well, you're actually going to have to wait about 5 months to close. They don't have that option.
Yeah.
So there has to be some leniency towards situations of sellers who do have some sort of a hardship that they simply can't afford to wait that period of time. He has a hardship. He has to be able to close during the period of time. Now, it's an economic hardship, so I don't know how much leniency they would give him. I'm hoping with the ordinance revisions of how to deal with people who need to sell quickly because of a sense of urgency, that simply have to. With the waiver of the notice, you can't waive the notice of the sale. But when you deliver that notice of that you're under contract and that right of first refusal, you can waive that.
Okay.
So once you serve them that notice that they have the right to exercise the right of first refusal, there is a section of the form where they can say that I'm not buying the building. I don't care. I'll waive my right of first refusal, and that will then speed up the process.
But what is a problem? So let's just say, I get a buyer under contract, right? Our contracts state that you have 5 days due diligence. You have 5 days for attorney review and inspection, right? But so the buyer has to pay. They have to pay their attorney. They've got to pay for inspection, right? Yep. Inspections on multi-units can be up to $1,000. Yeah. We've got sewer scopes, right? If it's VA, we've got
and it
termite.
can take weeks to coordinate.
Because you've got to have access.
Yeah.
So now the buyer is having to come out of pocket for all those things when we don't know if the tenants are going to buy the property or not.
With no recourse. You can't, lien the property. You can't, it explicitly says that, the buyer has no rights in the situation.
So the only solution to that I see is that the seller will agree up front to reimburse the buyer if the deal falls through because of the right of first refusal. That's the only way I see that flying. Otherwise, we have to then extend attorney review and inspection until we clear right of first refusal, and then start the initial buying process on day 31.
Yeah.
Right? And now we're talking rate locks. You need to be extended.
This is a dangerous proposition, because what Brie's talking about, this happens sometimes with short sales, where with a short sale, the buyer says, well, we're not going to come out of pocket for doing the due diligence and doing the home inspection. So get it approved for the short sale first. Once get approved, then come back to us. Then it would be understandable if in this situation the buyer were to put the contract on the property and say, well, make sure the tenants are going to be okay with this first, then I'll spend the money out of pocket. The problem is then you're losing time, and you don't know if the buyer really is committed to the property or not.
Because they haven't even done the inspection yet.
They haven't done this, and that's
You know?
a very dangerous proposition for the seller. You absolutely want the buyer to do their inspection. Deals fall apart all the time.
90% of deals fall apart because of the inspection.
You know,
Once we get past inspection, like, it's pretty rare that something, you have to have a seller back out 3 different times, right?
Oh,
we just went through this hell of a deal.
So PTSD on that one.
It's pretty rare.
There's
But like inspections what's going to make or break the deal.
Yes.
So you have to have that done. You don't want to wait another 30 days. So the only option is for the seller to agree to, you do your due diligence, buyer, and I will reimburse you.
That's
right?
something that is going to have to be negotiated.
Yeah.
Because if you're the seller, you want that buyer, third-party buyer, fully committed. They've done the inspection. You know that they're going to move forward with purchasing it.
So the other issue, the other concern I have is, we talked about how the length of time to sell property, right, is now being extended. Mm-hmm. How long is the DOH going to take to give us whatever form we need for title to be able to close on it? So remember,
I don't know. I don't think they know right now.
I know, but remember, like, even a couple years ago, zoning search were taking like 4 months.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
so
thankfully that's gotten better, but that was.
They've gotten much better.
Yeah, that was bad.
But there was like a whole year where we were just closing without zoning certs.
Yeah.
And hoping for the best,
Yeah.
right? Or withholding money in escrow to then, in case the zoning cert came back not what we thought it was going to, right? But like we were still allowed to move forward with our process, right? And still able to conduct business in a timely manner.
It was messy.
It was messy,
Yeah.
but we kept moving. If the DOH takes months, weeks even, right? Again, we're completely messing with this process, and we have lending problems here too. Mm-hmm. There's rate locks, right? We just had a rate lock extension. It was $120 a day to extend their rate lock.
That's expensive.
So if you need to extend 3 months, you're talking tens of thousands of dollars, right? Or then who's going to pay to buy down the rate? If they need to release their lock and rates go up and we need a relock, right? There's fees associated with that to then be able to get the rate that you had originally. So how is that all going to play into this? So I also wanted to throw something else out there. This ordinance does not apply to vacant buildings.
Correct. Yes,
So,
and that is a very big issue. I'll be honest, I've had several clients that have called me when I reviewed over the details of this ordinance. They thought about it, and to a particular, they kind of said, okay. They got real quiet, and they thought about it, and said, so if I just remove all the tenants, I don't have to do anything, right? And I was like, as long as you rightfully, decide not to renew their leases and, remove it from the property, and it's fully vacant, you don't have to really do anything.
Bypass all
And they
this.
said, perfect. So there has been some concern, Brie and I have talked about, the unintended consequences of this ordinance. One of the concerns we have, the unintended consequences, one was about eliminating owner-occupied buyers. The second is this going to result in a wave of really unnecessary evictions or non-renewal of leases and a mass evacuation of the neighborhood because landlords and sellers are just not going to want to deal with this.
And that's the problem. Because the whole intent of this ordinance is to keep people in their homes.
Yes, it's exactly the opposite of the intention of the ordinance.
And if this gets to be too difficult and too hard to deal with, right, then absolutely landlords will just vacate their buildings and sell them vacant and bypass all of this. So...
And that was something else I saw in DC where it became normal practice. I do want to touch on 2 things that we kind of glossed over real quick. One is we're talking a lot about Department of Housing, and I want to make sure we're not throwing them under the bus. No. Department of Housing was given, in my opinion, a really impossible task.
Well, yeah, we'll start with that.
Okay.
But
Okay.
you have to know, this ordinance was passed in one day. Made effective that day.
Yes. This was quite literally dumped in Department of Housing's lap. So we're not being critical of Department of Housing.
Yeah.
This was quite literally, with no warning whatsoever, dumped on them. And the reason was this ordinance specifically was passed with the intention of, at least the alderman who passed it, with the intention of providing no warning. So this was done intentionally. It's important that everyone understand that. The alderman did this intentionally to give no warning because they didn't want to give sellers the opportunity to prepare to try to get properties sold before the ordinance went into effect. So they intentionally did this, which has caused a tremendous upheaval for the realtors, the sellers, Department of Housing. So when we keep mentioning Department of Housing, I'm not trying to be critical. For anyone who works there, my heart goes out to you because you've been given a monumental task with no warning whatsoever. I hope that they increase their budget. So we're going to keep mentioning Department of Housing throughout this. They're doing the best they can. We really, they were given a really hard job. So we're not being critical of them.
So I also wanted to clarify too, the demolition part, the demolition increased fee, that is effective immediately.
Yes, that's
that
not
has not been pushed off at any point. So the right of first refusal starts March 1st. The demolition increased fee started October 9th, which was the day this was passed. As a way also for them to be like, not want to sneak in deals before the deadline and not pay the increased fee. Additionally, if any sort of public funds are used to purchase the property, so say the tenants decide they do want to buy the property, right, and they want to use a City of Chicago grant, which there are plenty of them, to then buy the property and become homeowners, that property must remain affordable housing for 30 years.
Yeah. Yes.
So multifamily is different in that it's considered a commercial asset. So we're talking about 5 and above.
Yeah.
But the thing is, it's valued differently. So multifamily assets are valued based on your net operating income or your NOI. So when we talk about things like the ability to use public funds and then keep that affordable housing for the next 30 years, that directly impacts your NOI.
Yes. Yeah.
So that greatly devalues literally the entire property for the next 30 years, which is going to be a huge impact if people choose to do that. And again, we're talking about tenants who are coming together and forming an association who are likely not represented by a realtor, who don't know these things. Everything they've been saving for has been completely wiped out, and they're going to have trouble selling that building. So even if they want to sell it in 5 years,
it's capping
the income,
the value of the property.
Yes.
So whenever we look at an apartment building, when you look at a single family home, you use what we would call the comparable approach. You look at all the different houses in the neighborhood and come up with what it's worth. Particularly when you get to 5 and up, a true apartment building, commercial apartment building, comps don't play any role in it whatsoever. You're purely looking at the income approach. And the income approach is you take the amount of rent you're bringing in, you look at the expenses, what's the profit at the end of the year, you take that, generally multiplied by 10, gives you the value of the property. So what Brie's talking about is, not that the affordable housing's bad, but if you have a restriction of being able to have it be affordable housing for 30 years, it really prevents the growth of the income for the property, for the increasing any of the leases. Now, if you're one of the tenants and you're buying the property, that sounds great now. But what happens in 5, 10, 15 years, when you go to sell the building, you have 2 problems. One is, particularly, let's say in only 5 years, everyone decides, hey, let's cash out and sell the building. This will be great. Buyers are not going to be willing to pay as much for it because they're going to see that, okay, well, we still have 25 more years with this covenant on the property that I'm not going to be able to raise the rent, so I'm not going to pay that much for this property because you've seriously capped how much we can raise these rents. So that's been a lot of concerns from the investment community is, I don't know if this is going to have the effect that you guys necessarily want. Short term, it'll be great for the tenants, but long term, when you guys go to sell the property and go to hopefully make a profit, as everyone hopes to do when we sell a property, it's not really going to be there.
Correct. Property ownership and being a landlord is very expensive. And I can tell you, 13 years of being a landlord, right, it all comes and goes in waves. So
yes,
when one bad thing happens, 5 bad things happen,
yes,
right? I just spent $45,000 on one of my properties this year. just
And-
fixing it up, right?
Yeah.
That's one 3-unit property, $45,000 just this year.
And that's just a 3. When you're dealing with the 5 and up on the multifamily.
I mean, a commercial roof can be $80,000.
Yeah, the repairs are people don't realize it is very expensive. They think, well, it's double the size of 3 flats. So
No.
it is. There's like a bell curve where it's just when you're dealing with a multifamily, expenses just shoot up. It's very, very expensive to do repairs.
And so now we're talking about a group of tenants who have come together to enjoy the joys of homeownership. Maybe have not been consulted on business expenses.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like I said, like something like replacing the windows, even on a 10-unit building, is going to cost $60,000. Mm-hmm. Are they well capitalized? Are they putting away money for reserves every month? Right? What's going to happen?
That will be a concern.
You know, that would be a huge concern.
Yeah.
So property prices have increased, right? Obviously, in the last 30 years. Rents have obviously increased in the last 30 years. Expenses have obviously increased in the last 30 years. And this property is going to remain stagnant.
The real estate taxes keep going up.
Oh, tax.
Yeah. It's just everything gets more expensive. So whenever you're capping the amount of income you can bring in, the expenses
for 30 years.
Yeah, the expenses are going to keep going up. My expectation would be, particularly for the tenant associations, whatever financing is going to be provided by the public, from the city of Chicago, they're pretty much going to be stuck with whatever that is. Because there really isn't going to be anyone else to shop it to. It's that or nothing. I mean, this whole process, at least the way it is now, unless they amend it, it's basically impossible to do a 1031. So you take an investment and you buy a similar investment and you don't have to pay taxes on the profits from it.
At this time.
At this time. Later on, you're kicking the can down the road. So you sell a building. You don't get to take the money from the sale. We have what's called a 1031 intermediary. It's a company that you bring in with the transaction. We coordinate all of that. When you sell the property, we take your money, we put it in with this 1031 intermediary. They make sure everything complies with the IRS regulations. And then when you go to buy a property, which has to be pretty soon after, there's a very strict timeline there, you then take that money to buy the next property, and you don't have to pay any taxes on it to the IRS. The problem is, there's a very strict timeline with it. You only have about
45 days.
45 days to identify a property, and then you almost immediately are getting ready to go to closing.
Yeah.
That time goes by very quickly. So anyone who, in this area, the 606, unless you could somehow go and get those waivers from the tenants right away, this is almost going to exclusively eliminate anyone from doing a 1031 from this neighborhood. Yeah. So anyone that's looking to do a 1031 sale and a buy, I don't see any way that the agents are not going to have to tell people, look, you're not going to be able to buy anything in this neighborhood because it's just not going to work. So it's going to eliminate all of those. Again, these are not institutional investors. These are these mom and pop investors who are selling their property, moving. Maybe they're selling a 2-flat they did really well in. Now they want to buy a 3-flat and renovate it or do something there. They're not going to be able to do it. Investors already have to deal with the Chicago RLTO. We have the Cook County RLTO. There's significant red tape with zoning, building court, real estate taxes. This is just
Fair notice ordinance.
I mean,
Chicago's not known as a landlord-friendly city.
No, investors still come here because there's still incredible investment opportunities, and it's a great place long-term to invest in. But it also is exhausting to some point that you essentially have to have an attorney in Chicago because there's so much red tape. I joke about it, but investors really rely on the agents. They rely on the attorneys a lot to navigate them through a tremendous amount of red tape.
Absolutely.
And it's just one more thing that, if you add it to the entire picture, would make an investor go, that's that area where I can't deal with anymore. Enough. I already have to deal with all this other stuff. I don't need one more thing that I have to deal with. I have to pay my attorney to look at for me. I'm not going to buy anything over there. And we are seeing some pushback from investors saying, look, I'm just not going to go over there then. I don't need to deal with one more set of legal red tape that I'm already dealing with all my other properties.
So I can tell you, just from my business, which is mainly 2 to 4 unit properties, I at this point will not take on a single client in that area that won't use you as their attorney.
Well, good.
I'm not kidding. This is so involved. And there's so many little details that, keep in mind, the fines can be up to $1,000 per day for noncompliance.
Yeah, it's pretty serious non-compliance. Yeah,
There's
it's
very serious noncompliance.
Yeah.
I caution all of you out there watching this, please work with an investor agent. Right now is not the time to work with your cousin, brother, friend from college, whatever, who became a realtor 6 months ago from the suburbs, or even parts of the city that does condos downtown. It is a very, very different part of the business, right?
Yes.
Absolutely use an investor agent who knows investment properties. You absolutely at this time have to use an agent if you're in one of these areas that knows this ordinance. And a simple way to know is to ask them, what do you think of this ordinance and how is it going to affect my ability to buy or sell? And listen to their answer. Right? If they can talk intelligently off the top of their head, right, they're probably a great agent to work with. If they say things to you like, let me get back to you, or let me do some research for you, probably not the time to use them. So, from my understanding, the DC ordinance was kind of the framework of this ordinance.
It's the one that everyone else uses. So right of first refusal was basically created in DC. There was a pilot program in the 70s, but the actual ordinance was passed in the 1980. There has been a massive influx of cities that have passed their right of first refusal in the last 2 to 3 years. So I have a list on my desk. You have 1980 in DC, then you have, I think there was a county in Maryland in 1987, and then there's one or two, and then all of a sudden in the last 3 years, there's 10 or 12 cities that have done this. So this is becoming very, very, very popular. Minneapolis, San Francisco, Baltimore. It's something that has New York is New York's always got tenant laws. New York's been playing around with it. It is very quickly expanding. So if you're watching this video and this isn't affecting your neighborhood, it could, because this is something that is very, very, very quickly evolving and is expanding across the United States. It could be something, if it's not already in your town, there's a chance that your local city council or your county government has been talking about it, because we're seeing it across the country where it's being proposed. The DC one's fascinating because it's the most data. We saw an influx of tenant purchases probably about 20 years ago. DC's also been very upfront that in the last 5 years, the tenant purchases have gotten very low, very, very, very low. I think just because of financing and different things. The one thing that I saw specifically addressed in the Chicago ordinance that was a problem that came from the DC ordinance, the DC ordinance has an absolute right to the tenant to assign their rights to anyone else. And there's a great court case that I can give everyone the site to. I don't have it by heart, but I can send it to you to put in the comments in the video.
I'll put it on the screen.
There was someone sued because they had a 2-flat, and both. This is DC. This isn't here. We would assume the same rule would apply here. So you had a 2-flat in DC. Tenant on the first floor, tenant on the second floor. Both tenants say, I want to buy the property. Well, what do you do? So they get in a little bit of a bidding war with the two tenants. So tenant B puts in the higher offer. But then tenant B moves out of the property and assigns their contract to buy the building to an investor. Now tenant A is still in the property, and tenant A sues and says, well, what the hell's going on? I'm here, I'm a tenant, I should be able to buy the property. And the court said, no. The court said that the investor gets to step in the shoes of the investor, because the tenants, part of the reason I like that case is it gives a lot of analysis of tenants with this right of first refusal is, in the eyes of the law, their ability to either waive their right to the right of first refusal or to exercise the right to purchase is an absolute right that they can bargain or sell or do whatever they want. So if a tenant, in this case, the tenant, if they received a benefit from this investor, they never said in the case what the tenant got for doing this, but if the tenant got a benefit from this investor to assign their contract, That's their right to do so. They get to do that. And the seller had to treat the investor, even though they're an investor, had to treat them the same as though they would if they were selling it to the tenant. The investor gets to step in the tenant's shoes. Now that goes for any property in DC. So you can imagine the problems that causes DC. So
Okay.
you could potentially in the city of Chicago run into the same scenario of tenant A, tenant B, be assigned to an investor. The investor gets to step in the shoes of the tenant and be treated as the tenant to buy the property under the right of first refusal. So they're not treated as the third party purchaser at that point.
Yeah.
They're treated as the buyer under the right of first refusal, and they get to circumvent the other tenants of the property or other tenant in the property.
So since the 80s, how
Mm-hmm.
many times have tenants actually bought the properties in DC? It was a little over 500, right?
Yeah, it depends on who you talk to. People who are critical of the ordinance will say it doesn't have a very high percentage. People for tenant groups will say, look, there's hundreds of people that have been able to use this project to buy properties to secure affordable housing, and in their eyes, that's a success. So it's a little difference of opinion, but it has worked. It has worked where many tenants have been able to purchase these properties. Not a high percentage. It's not like it's going to be all the properties, but you're going to see a high percentage of them not have the tenant purchase it. But you will get a healthy number of tenants get the opportunity to do that. Although I should point out, of the ones that don't go through, the tenants don't buy them. That doesn't mean some deal isn't being cut.
Yeah.
So it is, and it was again in the court decision. The judge was putting this in the decision that it is very normal in DC for the investors to come in and during the point that they're doing the inspection to negotiate with all the tenants face to face. What do you want? What do you want? That can include cash. That can include. I believe the terminology they used was the cafeteria negotiations. So cafeteria meaning the investor goes to the tenants and says, okay, pick and choose what you want. So some tenants may say, look, we'll take money. Some tenants may say, look, I like everything, but I would like all new windows and appliances. The tenant may say, I want I'll agree to, you to buy the building and I'll waive my right of first refusal, but I want you to give me a 3-year lease.
With no increase.
Or with no increase, or I'm paying $1,000 now. I want it at $750 for 3 years, or something like that. And, the investor who just wants to buy the building says, okay, and signs off on it. So they're cutting these deals with all the tenants to sign off on the sale of the building. So it's much more of the tenants. It's interesting. The tenants are actively negotiating with the investor.
Yeah.
So when you're going through this process as the landlord, it's really you take a step back, you bring the buyer to the table, and then it's up to the buyer and the tenants to sort of work out this deal together as far as what they're going to do, what the tenants are going to get. It seems like that's much more prevalent that you're dealing with those scenarios.
So this summer I had a situation, not super usual, but this goes back to as a owner of a 3 to 4, as an owner of a small multifamily building, do not lease up your units for a year and then put them in the market. So I was representing the buyer, but my buyer went to go see a property that was fully leased up, right? The seller got no offers from anyone that was not owner occupied. So he had no other option but to buy out a lease. Guess what that buyout cost?
$10,000.
What's a reasonable buyout for a lease, you think, in Chicago?
Tenants will usually want. I find a lot of times the tenants will ask for $10,000. I don't know where that number comes from, but they want 10. What is
20.
20? Oh boy. Okay.
Now I think in this particular situation, right? I think the tenants, they all banded together. By the way, they all talked to each other,
All right.
and wanted to stick it to this landlord. He wasn't the nicest landlord, so I think that was part of the reason. But $20,000, right, to buy out a tenant. So now you take that and multiply that by an 8-unit, right, potentially.
Oh, it's 8 unit. Oh, okay.
What if you had an 8-unit?
Yeah.
We're talking about we're talking about larger multifamily here. Is that what it's going to take to get these deals done now in this market? And if that's the case, why wouldn't you go a half a mile north or, another part of the city that doesn't have this ordinance, and just buy there? right? So that's going to be an issue.
That's an issue.
You know, you did mention it earlier, like, this is not a problem that is specific to just landlords and buyers and sellers in this market.
No.
This is a whole Chicago landlord problem. This is potentially a Cook County landlord problem.
Yes.
Right? If we don't work together and get aligned now, you know, this could very well get away from us and be everyone's problem.
But a lot of aldermen have said, depending on how this goes, they may be looking at expanding this into their wards. So this is something that's going to be very fluid.
So one thing to also understand is that this was passed, like we said, very, we'll call it secretively, very quickly.
Just with no warning.
No warning. Due to something called aldermanic prerogative, which means that every alderman of their ward has the right to make zoning and building decisions for their ward, which is why the map is specific to certain areas. So at any given point, under the aldermen can make their own decisions.
Correct.
So this could, again, depending on the success or perceived success of this, pass in different parts of the city, but not all parts of the city.
It goes ward by ward. It'll
Yeah.
go ward by ward if it does expand. It won't be citywide. I don't think they'll get enough support to make it citywide, but it could very certainly be, they'll leave it up to the aldermen if they want to copy and paste this into their specific wards.
My opinion is I completely 100% support the preservation of 2 to 4 unit properties in Chicago.
Absolutely.
I think that the demolition and deconversion of 2 to 4 units in Chicago is a huge problem. It has been a huge problem for at least the last 13 years I've been a landlord in Chicago.
Long time.
And something needs to be solved, right, to stop the problem. So kudos to the aldermen for taking action, because I think they're the first ones that have actually took action on this. Negative is, though, like, this was not thought through about how it actually impacts the business process and normal course of, like, day-to-day title companies, lenders, right, agents, buyers, sellers. So there are amendments, right, or shifts, we can say, like tweaks to the ordinance.
Not tweaks.
That could
Yes.
make this very, very workable, right, and be a complete compromise. And I completely support their objective of what it's trying to accomplish. I just don't support the way that it is being done. I think there's much better ways of doing it.
We talked about unintended consequences of financing. We talked about unintended consequences of displacing affordable housing as opposed to preserving it, which is the opposite of the intention here. There's also the element of there's landlords that are concerned about the retaliatory nature of the tenant rights. So we want to speed this up as much as possible. We want the tenants to work with us. But what happens if you only need one tenant to decide they're going to stick it to the landlord?
Yeah.
And we both experienced that when a landlord or
Absolutely.
a tenant just decides they're going to go out of their way to be as difficult as possible. The tenants are given these rights of how much time they have to get notice, how much time they have to review the process. You could potentially be dealing with a tenant that if they have 90 days for the right of first refusal, they're going to wait till day 90. And they're going to stretch this process out and make it as difficult as possible.
So one of the good things, the amendments that came through in early December were huge changes for us. One of them being on a 5+ unit building. Once 50% of the tenants have waived their rights,
I saw
it's
that.
considered waived.
Yeah, I saw that.
So if you do have a rogue tenant, right, that wants to stick it to the man, you know, if they're in the minority and you've got 50% that waive it, you're fine.
Yes.
Right?
Okay, that's good.
Like, but you absolutely do see those situations where tenants just want to stick it to the landlord. So
even under a normal sale, we deal a lot with tenants that just do not want to cooperate under any
Absolutely.
circumstances whatsoever. Yeah.
We've got a whole nother 10 hours of video
talking
about
tenant
that.
problems. Yeah.
But one thing I said, like, in my part of the business, only once have I ever seen a tenant buy a building. So as the listing agent,
I've done a couple. They're rare.
They are rare. Most of my listings are properties that I then sold to my buyers years ago that are now selling. So I know my buyers really, really well. I think the fun part about my job is it's not a one and done transaction, right? No one comes to me and says, Brie, I want to buy one investment property, and then I'm done. Usually we've got, they have some sort of 5-year, 10-year plan,
Yeah.
right? And it is a long-term relationship. And because I have so much knowledge of landlording in Chicago, I get, phone calls from I talk to most of my clients at least once a year, right? I got bed bugs. What do I do? I have this. What do I do? Like, how do I handle this? Because that's all I do day in and day out is Chicago real estate. So it's much easier for them to come to me so that it then develops that relationship with them. I can tell you from my client base, 100% of them, without even having an ordinance in place, would absolutely love to sell to one of their tenants.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, they have good relationships with their tenants, right? I'm not worried about the rogue tenant sticking it to the man, not with at least my clients, because I've trained them better, right? And even without this ordinance in place, right, every single time the owner has sought to proceed with that process.
I think I get about maybe once a year. So it's not incredibly prevalent. I've done several of them, but it's not as common as you would hope it would be.
Yeah.
But we do try. If you're a tenant and you want to buy the property that you're living in, you don't have to wait for this ordinance to be able to do that. There's other vehicles out there. This just kind of helps push it along. But if you're interested in doing that and you're not in the 606 neighborhood, you can absolutely still do it. You just have to see what program. There's programs out there. You just need to work with someone like Brie that can help you out with that. People work with Brie to make sure that you get the correct financing that you need to buy the property.
So what can you do? First thing is, reach out to your alderman, right? Again, I've talked with a couple that are very strongly opposed to this. So this is a Chicago landlord problem. Reach out to your specific alderman, start a conversation, right? Some of them have been very, very responsive to our inquiries, right, and our suggestions. Obviously, like and share this video with every single Chicago landlord, Cook County landlord that you know, right? I feel that a lot of them have no idea this is going down. I've even talked with other agents who have no idea this is going down. And this has been going on since October, right? This is a very large community in Chicago of landlords because we're so much mom and pops.
Yeah. Vast majority are mom and pops.
How do you reach, how do we tell all those investors what's going on? So, share, send this with any investor community that you do, any meetup group that you go to, right? Any Facebook group, any neighbor, friend, cousin, brother, whoever, who's a landlord in Chicago has got to know about this. Currently, there is no actionable steps at this moment, right? We don't know.
Until March, really.
We don't know exactly how this is going to fully impact our businesses and fully impact the landlord's business. I would suggest following the NBOA online. They are a collective.
They've been great. They've been a fantastic group, yeah.
They've been, they're a collective of local Chicago, Cook County builders associations that is educating their members and doing community outreach about the information in this ordinance. So definitely follow the NBOA, and we will stay tuned for any actionable steps that come up that we can take as landlords to get involved.
We'll continue to update you. We'll get you the information that you need.